All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third town hall from former Congressman Jim Renacci and Ohio's Future Foundation. Tonight, our conversation is on the broken tax system in Ohio. If you have been on our previous Zoom conversations, we're going to do things a little bit different tonight as the team is in different locations. As usual, Jim will open up the conversation. But when we come to the question and answer part, I'll step in and moderate. Um, we'll call you out one at a time as the questions come through. If you want to get involved and ask a question, we encourage that. That's why we're here tonight. We want this to be a conversation. But be sure to click the raise your hand option on your Zoom dashboard there, so you can get in the mix and ask a question. Also, just as a reminder, you can now find our previous um, Zoom town halls on jimrenacci.com, as well as some other good information. This should be a very interesting conversation tonight. So let's get right to our topic, our town hall number 3, tax to death in Ohio. Please welcome 40-year businessman and former Congressman Jim Renacci.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thank you all for joining tonight. This is going to be an exciting evening. This is our third town hall. We have now broken this out to very specific topics. If you're on the first town hall, if you haven't seen, as Tom said, the first or second town hall, go to jimrenacci.com and you'll see those. But what we thought we would do, and this is more about learning from you, hearing from you, getting your information. It's a town hall. It's an opportunity for you to ask questions. It's an opportunity for me to learn too at the same time. But let me tell you a little bit about myself first, because as we have these town halls, we know we continue to get new people, different people, and individuals who have not really gotten to know who Jim Renacci is. Look, I came to Ohio in about 38 years ago, actually, and moved here as a young adult right out of college. Started my first business at the age of 24 with just a couple $100. Created in the span of 3 decades. I took that one business to 60 businesses, created 1,500 jobs, and employed 3,000 people. During that period of time, I operated everything from nursing homes to a construction company, to a car dealer, 2 car dealerships, to a 3 Harley Davidson dealerships that I was involved with, to an amphitheater, minor league baseball team, minor league football team, and the list goes on and on and on. And during that period, I did all of that business in Ohio. So I got to know Ohio very well, from one corner of the state to the other. I built nursing homes, developed nursing homes, operated nursing homes, had my CPA firm, which I was also a partner in, actually worked across the state. So I knew all the small towns from Felicity, Ohio, all the way up to Geneva on the lake. These are all towns that I was, had either gone into, was a part of. So I got to know Ohio very well. And quite frankly, never really thought I would get involved in politics. For those of you who wonder how I did get into politics, my car dealership, my Chevy dealership in 2009 was a General Motors dealership. I had taken it over. It was troubled. We had turned it around. We had 58 employees. Life was good. I just signed an agreement with General Motors to build a brand new location out on the highway. General Motors was extremely happy with what we were doing. They were extremely happy with, our ability to really market and sell cars in Northeast Ohio. And they were talking us kind of being like the super store in Northeast Ohio. I live in Wadsworth, Ohio, which is about 17 miles west of Akron and about 35 miles south of Cleveland, right on Route 76. So any of you who have traveled over to New York by coming up 71 from the Columbus area or Dayton area and cut across 76 to head east, you have cut right through the town of Wadsworth. And that's where my dealership was. They were happy with what we were doing. And then lo and behold, in 2009, under the Obama administration, the Chevy dealerships, the General Motors got taken over. And all of a sudden, General Motors went dark. toward their dealers, which I was one of them. I had no idea what was going on until I got a notice I guess it was around May or June of 2009, that my dealership was not going to be selected to continue moving forward. Now, for anybody that's in business, uh, that is a very, very tough uh, thing to swallow. I told people it was like getting kicked in the stomach. My business was being taken away from me by the federal government. And I called my congressman. I didn't know much about Congress at that time. I called my congressman. He came up to visit with me, met with me, met the staff, and told me he would do everything he could to help me get my dealership back. The problem was when he went back to Washington, by the way, he was a Democrat. When he went back to Washington, there was a vote on the House floor to reinstate my car dealership along with a whole bunch of car dealerships across Ohio. He voted against it. And it was the second kick in the stomach for me because now I thought I could trust a US congressman. And some of you are probably smiling when I say that because you can't trust a politician, but I thought I could. And ultimately, I called him up. I said to him, not only did you lie to me, but I can't trust you, and I'm going to do whatever I can to remove you. And I stepped up 30 days later when I saw nobody else was going to be able to remove him. He was an incumbent. I spent the next 14 months in a race that I never really understood. I mean, national politics is a pretty tough thing. And I ended up defeating him in 2010. So I went to Congress in 2011. Spent 8 years, but after about 6 years of being in Congress and a business guy, I saw that it was broken. I was still operating my businesses. I saw that Congress was broken. I saw there was no way we could ever get anything done. And then I realized that the only place to fix things was back in Ohio. So in my 7th year in Congress, I made the announcement that I was going to leave Washington and come back to Ohio and run for governor. So for those of you that remember, in 2017, there were 4 governor candidates in the race in the Republican Party. I was one of them. And then Josh Mandel stepped out of the race for Senate. They were looking for somebody to get into the Senate race. I said I wouldn't do it, even though I was doing pretty well and getting known pretty well around the state. I got a call from the President of the United States at that time, President Trump, and he asked me to get in the Senate race, which I didn't want to do, but I do always explain this. It's very difficult when you get a call from the President of the United States not to at least listen and try and respond. And that's what I did. To serve my country, I jumped into the Senate race. And we lost, but we lost very close. Lost by 150,000 net votes out of 4.4 million votes. I ran against an incumbent, Sherrod Brown. Most of you know that name. And again, he spent 33.5 million. I spent 4. He outspent me 8-1, but I still almost beat him. But I will tell you, it was a good learning experience for me because I was still traveling the state. I still realized our state was broken. I still realized there were so many problems from the north to the south, the east and the west. There were so many issues at our state. And I continued to learn as to how we could fix it. And once I lost the election, I formed Ohio's Future Foundation, which is who's sponsoring this event tonight. And Ohio's Future Foundation, we continue to travel the state. I teamed up with Walsh University. We went around from city to city in 2019, trying to really get an understanding of why Ohio was losing so much ground. And then we formulated a plan, and now we're rolling that plan out. So basically, I can tell you about my bio is that Jim Renacci is a 30-year businessman who has created 1,500 jobs, employed over 3,000 people, did run for Congress because the federal government took something away from me, left Congress because I do believe Washington's broken, and decided that it's time to fix Ohio. By the way, I wrote a book called The GOP's Lost Decade. It's on Amazon. And some of my background's in there, but a lot of why Washington's broken in there too. And if you do happen to see it on Amazon and purchase it, I just want you to know that all those proceeds go to the USO, so they don't come to me. But there is a good story in there about why Washington is broken. Um, so let's talk. Let's start talking about we're on our third town hall. Washington is broken. We have to fix Ohio. Some of the things we talked about in our first town hall was we spend too much, we tax too much, and quite frankly, people are leaving. It's interesting. You see a slide up there because people say we tax too much. So why do we tax so much? Well, one of the reasons we tax too much is we spend too much. And an interesting slide up there shows you that if you compare the state of Ohio, Ohio spends approximately $75.5 billion in their budget. And by the way, that's not all their spending. The Tax Foundation who has some really good research information. The state of Ohio probably spends double that. You just don't know about it because they're called shadow budgets. They spend money in workers' compensation. They spend money over in the area of roads and bridges. None of that's in the 75.5 billion. The 75.5 billion is the operating budget. But let's compare the operating budget to other states. Look at Georgia. Georgia has 11 million people. Ohio has 11.7 million people. Georgia spends $43.2 billion. Ohio spends $75.5 billion. That's a serious problem. North Carolina, 10.7 million people. They only spend 52.1 billion. Ohio spends 75.5 billion. Michigan, somewhat close to us. Also, one of the states that's attached to what we call the Midwest and right next to Ohio, spends 59.2 billion with 10 million people. Look at Florida, 88.1 billion. Say, well, that's a lot of money. That's not very much more than Ohio, but they have 22 million people, twice as many people. So you could see that Ohio spends way too much money. And I told you in the first and second town hall that we spend too much money because we're redirecting it in the wrong places. Some of it's Medicaid expansion and Medicaid dollars. That's a big amount of dollars that Ohio spends. And by the way, the Medicaid budget in Ohio is growing so fast. And then when Governor Kasich introduced Medicaid expansion, it even accelerated. So we've gone from $17 billion in the Kasich, all the way back previous to Kasich, now up to 35 billion dollars. A big amount of money is being spent, and we're going to zero in on. We're going to have a town hall just on Medicaid and Medicaid dollars and where they go and how they're spent. But I'm telling you, that's a big part of the budget. Ohio's spending is broken down into Medicaid. It's education, K through 12 and higher education. It's the prison system. It's roads and bridges. Those are the primary dollars, but we spend way too much compared to other states, especially when it comes just to services. So when you ask the question about why are we taxed so much? Well, it's because we spend so much. So how would you balance the budget if you don't find taxes to pay for all that? And one of the problems we have is that we are taxed too much. And that's really the topic for tonight. And it's interesting because this is a slide that kind of shows what a person in Ohio and a person in Tennessee pays in income taxes and what's left for them. So look at John, who lives in Ohio. After he pays all his taxes with a salary of $65,000, he walks away with about $41,000. Jane, who lives in Tennessee, she walks away because they pay less taxes with about $47,000. That's an extra $5,500 a year just by living in Tennessee. Now, one of the interesting things, and we're going to talk about some of those taxes and why there are so many taxes and why Ohio taxes so much, but think about that. For those of you that are on the border of some of these states, if you just jump across the border, you could save $4, $5, $6,000 just by residing in a different state. By the way, the interesting thing is if you go to Florida, um, Florida's taxes are much less as well. And that's why we have so many Ohioans now taking residence in Florida. People say it's the weather. I will tell you, it's not the weather. In many cases, it's the tax situation. Many people that are in Florida, they don't want to stay in Florida. In fact, they always say to me, Jim, I would love to be back in Ohio more. The problem is I have to spend way too much money in taxes to stay in Ohio. And that's something we have to get fixed because otherwise we're going to continue to lose people. Now, there are some surveys out there, and I think the leadership, the state leadership said that uh, whether it was one of the moving companies said, we're one of the fourth most moved into states. Well, I'll give you a moving company that says we're one of the six most left states too. So in the end, we're losing population. And I'll tell you how you know we're losing population. No matter what you hear from the politicians, we one time had 23 members of Congress. We're down to 16 now. And I'll tell you, probably after this next census, we're going to know by August of this year, we're going to be down to 15. So if we're really growing, why are we losing members of Congress who are based on population compared to other states? Well, the answer is we're not growing compared to other states. We are losing ground compared to other states. And that's one of the reasons why we're taxed too much, we spend too much. So let's look at our ranking. Here's an interesting, this is an individual tax basis. New York, believe it or not, we all know that. It has the highest tax burden in the country. Hawaii, second highest. Vermont, third highest. But Ohio's 12th. So, and then look, South Carolina, 41st. Florida, 46th. Tennessee, 48th. Well, if you could save money and go to a different state, where do you think you're going to go? I'll tell you, I'll give you a real life story. My son's a doctor. He lives in New York right now. He's in his third year of residency. He'll be coming out of residency June of this year. He has an opportunity to live in Ohio or an opportunity to stay in New York. He actually did a comparison of the net taxes and the net amount of money that he will bring home by staying in New York City or coming to Ohio. Now, quite frankly, I thought he was going to come to Ohio until he showed me that the difference in net tax wages that he will take home is about $36,000. And that's between New York and Ohio. Now, if you look at those statistics, you would say, well, wait a minute, New York's at 12%, Ohio's at 9.34%. But the difference is he's going to get paid a lot more money to stay in New York as well. So even though we want him to come back to Ohio, even though we'd love him to come back to Ohio, the tax burden compared to the salary he's making, it's better off to stay in New York and come back to Ohio. So that tells you, even though New York's number one, the tax burden in Ohio is actually too high. And it's one of the reasons why we are losing people in this state individually, because you can move to other states and absolutely do better than staying here in Ohio. We got to fix that. We have to fix that. So one of the things that I've said is, why are there so many taxes? So let's talk about that in Ohio. And here's what's interesting. And we're going to open it up because I want to learn from all of you, but I already know our tax burden is too high. But think about the taxes we have. We have something called a CAT tax. Now, most people, if you're just an individual, you wouldn't pay a CAT tax. But if you own a small business, you do pay a CAT tax, because the CAT tax is levied on your gross amount of sales. I want to bring that up because we're going to have one series just on and talk about cat tax. The cat tax is a tax on your gross revenue. So if you have a small business in your small town, and let's say your small business makes 100,000, brings in $100,000 of sales. I don't know, you sell candles or widgets or whatever. And during the year, you bring in $100,000 worth of sales um, in that in that small little hometown business in Ohio. And let's say your expenses are 100,000, just to keep it simple. So you broke even, right? Well, in Ohio, and again, I'm going to raise that number up because there is a $250,000 deduction. So let's make it 500,000, but it's still a point. Even a small business, they bring in 500,000, they spend 500,000, they make no money, but they're going to pay a cat tax on that 500,000. They get a $250,000 deduction, and then they pay on the 250,000. So if you're a small business, and look, I operated a small CPA firm. I can tell you our gross revenues were more than 250,000. So in those instances, you pay a cat tax, even if you're a small business, based on your gross revenues. Now, I'll take it one step further. Let's say you were a bigger business and you made $10 million in sales and you had $10 million in expenses. So you lost money, or even $11 million in expenses. You lost $1 million. You still pay a cat tax. So why would any small business, again, and when I say small, that has more than $250,000 of revenues, why would they stay in Ohio when they can go to any other state and not pay that cat tax? That's one tax. But think about it. And many of you live in Ohio. Um, you pay a state sales tax. You pay a county sales tax. You pay a state income tax. You pay a city income tax. You pay property tax. You pay gasoline tax. You pay a utility tax. You pay a tax on your cell phones. There's an embedded cell phone tax. In some places, you pay a school levy. Other places, you pay a fire levy. Just think if you lived in a place that had all of these taxes. There are people in Ohio that live in places that have all of these taxes and have a small business that pays a cat tax. Think of the tax burden that you have when you're paying all these taxes. Now, it's interesting because you would say, well, what do other states do? That's a great question. Ohio is one of the few states, and I think it's between 3 and 5 states, that taxes everything. Now, the politicians would tell you we have very low taxes, and we do. And the tax foundation out of Washington, D.C. would tell you we have a very low tax on some things, but we also tax everything, everything. So when you start thinking about that, now some of you say, well, we don't tax food. When I say everything, I'm talking about there aren't many things that don't get taxed in the state of Ohio. Plus we have all these extra taxes like the school levies, the fire levies, the city tax. Those taxes aren't at other states. They're just not there. And that's why I've said all along, we have to reduce our tax burden. If we don't reduce our tax burden, we're going to have people like my son saying, you know what, I'm not coming back to Ohio. I'll just stay in New York. We're going to have people that say, I would rather go somewhere else. I'd rather go to Tennessee, who has very few taxes. And that's why we showed you the different tax burden between somebody in Tennessee and somebody in Ohio. And one of the reasons why we have so many taxes gets right back to where we started this from. We spend too much. Now, here's another little interesting thing that a lot of people don't want to talk about, but we have to. Why do we spend too much? Well, I told you we have Medicaid and we spend a lot in our budget, but we also have a state that has been built on growth. Remember, at one point in time, we were one of the third largest states in the country, and now I think we've moved to ninth. But anyway, we're moving further and further away from being the largest. But as we were growing, we were building more cities, we were building more school districts, we were building more colleges and universities, which are all great. By the way, here's an interesting statistic. Ohio has the second most number of colleges and universities in the country. Pennsylvania has number one. And who pays that tax? Who pays for those colleges and universities, especially the state-run schools? Who pays for the overhead in each city? Because remember, the cities were being built as the state grew. So who pays for the fire chief, the mayor, the auditor, the treasurer, all the different overhead of all these different cities? What we do, we pay it in taxes. And quite frankly, the more cities you have, the more overhead you have. The more schools you have, the more overhead you have. Remember, every school has a superintendent. Every school has a building. Every school has, we got superintendents, we got treasurers, we got principals. I'm not saying we get rid of those. And when we talk about this, a lot of times people say, well, wait a minute, you're talking about getting rid of things that I don't want to get rid of. No, I think we got to start talking about how do we reduce our overhead so we can reduce our tax liability. And that's the real key. How do we make sure that we are reducing our overhead and our burden? How do we get our state to quit spending, as the one slide showed you, 75.5 billion when Georgia's spending 43.2 billion? Well, one of the problems is Ohio is an aging state. Ohio is a state that's been around longer than and was a state that was booming with manufacturing, but now we're booming with overhead. And at some point in time, we got to start talking about that. And I think that's the key. Politicians too often are only worried about their next election and they forget about the next generation. So what you see too often in Columbus and in Washington are spending habits based on only the next election, not the next generation. By the way, from the federal government side, we're talking about a $1.9 trillion spend after we just spent 600 billion a month ago and trillions all last year. Who's going to pay for that? It's a scary thing. And it's one of the reasons why I say Washington is broken, but the only way we're going to fix it is to fix Ohio. So we got some work ahead of us. I am a CPA. I've done multiple tax returns. I still do my own tax returns. I still do business tax returns. But I want to open it up. Well, first off, I'm going to give you some solutions, and at least that we're learning. We can do some consolidation of taxing districts and reduce the tax burden at the same time. We can start to look at other states that don't have city income taxes and see how their cities grow and prosper, because their cities grow and prosper too. What's interesting, I owned a construction company. One of the biggest complaints in Ohio is if you have a business and you do business in 68 cities, which is what I did one time as a contractor, I had to file 68 tax returns. There's got to be a better way. And I think these are the things we can look at. So how do we reduce our tax burden? Well, number one, we reduce our expenses. We start to look at our overhead. We start to figure a way how to bring our costs down. And then we start to look at tax systems that are working around the country and are working to produce more efficient states and better states. This isn't going to happen in a year, and it's not going to happen in one election cycle, but I'm telling you, we got to do it. So one of the things we've put out there is we got to grow and move toward more of a consumption tax. And people get all up in arms. Renacci, that's a horrible idea. Well, wait a minute. If you eliminated every other tax that we have and just had consumption taxes, I think you would find that states that do that today, like Tennessee, like Texas, like Florida, by the way, all Republican states, are growing and prospering. When you look at states that have primarily the amount of taxes we have, we're going in the wrong direction. So there are things we can do. There are answers. I do think we have to reduce the burden. I do think we have to reduce the overhead. I do think we have to reduce the tax consequences of what's going on in our state so we can reduce our taxes. And then we can make a state and move toward more of a consumption tax model. Again, I'm not saying this is what we have to do. I'm saying this is what we have to talk about doing. If other states are doing it well, why can't we talk about it at least and see how we can get there? With that, why don't we open it up, Tom, to some questions? And I want to learn from some of the people on the town hall tonight and see what some of their issues are and what some of their thoughts are.
Yeah, great. We do have a nice lineup of questions tonight. First, we're going to go to Sam, who has a question. Who'll kick it off tonight?
Oh shit, that's me. Yeah, Mr. Renacci, thanks for taking my call. I wasn't expecting to be first. Just to let you know, I'm retired military. I live off a pension and a VA disability. And the one graphic that you showed, South Carolina, Tennessee, and I can't remember what the other, Florida. It's funny because I've got family in Tennessee and South Carolina, and they keep telling me to move down there. But I've got grandkids here in Ohio, and I have to stay close to them, you know. And a friend of mine actually turned me on to your Facebook page, and I was watching some of your posts and stuff about, you know, your ideas, but yet, you know, our government still has to run here in Ohio, you know, and talking tax, you know, tax cuts, which I totally agree with, but I mean, how do you expect to fund the government by cutting taxes, which I hate taxes, but it's a necessary evil. It's like you have to die and pay taxes, the two things in life.
Well, Sam, first off, thank you for staying in Ohio. It's one of the many reasons why I won't leave Ohio either. I have a brand new grandson, and my wife refuses to leave because of that. But how do you reduce taxes? You cut spending. And I think if you go back to the slide that I showed you earlier, when a state is spending 75.5 billion with 11.7 million people, and Georgia is spending 43.2 billion with 11 million people, and North Carolina is spending 52 billion with 10.7 million people, and Florida is spending 88 billion with 22 million people, we're clearly spending too much money. And that's what I keep getting at. How do you can't cut taxes right now because we spend too much. And until we get our spending in line, until we start looking at our overhead, until we start looking at all the cities that we have and the communities they have and the taxing jurisdictions that we have, and until we start deciding that we're going to start reducing our overhead, we're not going to be able to cut taxes. But at the same time, if you start to look at what the governors have been doing in the state of Ohio for the last 20 years, they just keep raising spending. Look, Governor DeWine raised his budget, his first budget was, I think, approximately a 6% increase across the board. He raised spending for department heads on an average by 25% and added a brand new department, which he put his lieutenant governor in. And then he gave that new department a media person, a chief of staff, all of these expenses. Well, if you're going to keep spending, continue to add spending, you can't cut taxes. But what we should be doing is we should be looking at twofold, just like I did in the business world. I told you, I operated over 60 businesses, created over 1,500 jobs, employed over 3,000 people. I would go back to every one of those businesses. By the way, most of those businesses were in trouble spending too much money. That's why I took them over. First thing we did is we looked at all our overhead and our spending, and we tried to bring it down. And then we reduced our our sales, our individual costs for product. So we were able to reduce our price on our goods and services, which is the same as the state. You reduce your overhead, you can reduce your tax consequences. And I think that's the only way we can do it. We have to look at ways to get our expenses in line. And we can't just keep spending like the federal government does and the state does.
Great. Our next question is from Tara Bowler.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for taking my question. My husband and I are wondering why our property taxes have doubled and in some places have even tripled over the last 5 to 10 years. We've been in our house 13 years and have seen a huge increase in our property taxes without any seen benefit to the taxpayers themselves. We've noticed it on our tax bill. We've talked to friends and family in different areas and they've noticed the same thing. Can you give some insight to that?
Sure. Well, think about it, and thank you for the question. The state of Ohio, if you look at the graphs, we're not reducing our spending, we're increasing our spending every year. So we cut our corporate tax rate, and everybody says, "Yay, we cut our corporate tax rate." And then you say, "Well, we cut our individual tax rate. Yay, we cut our individual tax rate." But our spending kept going up. It gets back to Sam's question. How do you cut taxes and keep spending money? The answer is you shift it. And that's what we've done. We've shifted most of the burden over to the property tax. So we haven't really cut taxes. There are some people in the state of Ohio that their taxes, their property taxes are up 400%. And that's because we continue to have the same amount of overhead. We continue to have the same expenses and the same overhead in our schools. We continue to have the same amount of school districts that we've had 25 years ago. And for any of the teachers on the call, I'm not saying we should get rid of teachers. What I'm saying is when you know that your population is declining, your 14-year-old, your 15-year-old, and their 16-year-old. By the way, an interesting statistic, in 2034, we'll have the fewest number of 17-year-olds in the history of the state of Ohio. Now, for any of you that can think about that, that tells us that we're not producing the same amount of children that we used to produce. And if in 2034, we have the least amount of 17-year-olds in the history of the state of Ohio, and yet we have the same amount of school districts, the same amount of colleges and universities, and yet we're funding all those, yet we have less people going to them. We know it's coming. I mean, 2034, people say, well, that's 13 years from now. Well, yeah, but you got to plan for it. Well, if you know that, you better start consolidating and figuring out what you're going to do, because in the end, one of the reasons why your property taxes goes up is because you got to continue to fund all the overhead. And just because we've dropped corporate tax or dropped our individual tax rates, we still got to pay the burden of all these expenses. And it's one of the reasons why the property tax has gone up. And by the way, easy one to raise, because you know what you do? You just go in, you reappraise everybody's house, and you say, hey, your house went from 100,000 to 125,000. And you go, well, that's great. My house is worth 125,000. I always have to chuckle, because as a CPA and a business guy, most of the times your house isn't worth 125,000. It's just the state auditor or the county auditor saying that they believe it's worth 125,000. Between you and me, I think you got to always take a look at that, because that's the easiest way to raise your taxes, is just to raise the value of a house. And most people like the idea of thinking their house is worth more than it might be. Your house is only worth what somebody's willing to pay for it, not what the county auditor tells you it's worth. So thank you for your question, but we do have a problem. We have to cut those. We got to do something to reduce that tax burden.
Thanks, Tara. We're going to go to a phone caller who's on the phone line. That's Jack. Jack, you will have to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yep, now you're on.
All right. Actually, I have two questions, but I don't want to tie up all your time. But my first one would be, why is Ohio one of the few states left that actually have city taxes? I got a lot of family in other states that don't pay city taxes.
Well, it's a great question. And I'll tell you, it's because we have a tax system that was based on city taxes. I have family in Pennsylvania. There is no city tax. I have family in Florida. There is no city tax. I have family in South Carolina. There is no city tax. We are one of the few states that does have a city income tax system to fund our cities. There are other ways of doing it. Now, if you're a mayor of the city, you probably don't want to hear me say this, but there are ways to make sure your city gets funded. And there are ways to do it without having an extra layer of tax that is burdensome and spread between, multiple jurisdictions. So it's very unique. I think and don't hold me to this for anybody that's statistically going to fact check me. I think there's only 3 states that still have the type of taxes we have, which includes the city income tax. And in the end, I think what we should be doing is looking at ways to make sure our cities are funded, but at the same time, make sure our cities are funded in a way that we don't burden multiple overheads of multiple jurisdictions. I'm going to give you an example. Tennessee, let's go back to Tennessee. Tennessee pays a regional tax, and that regional tax is then distributed between all the cities and communities inside that region. Now, I can hear somebody already on this call saying, what is Renacci talking about? I'm a mayor, I'm a township, and I don't want anybody touching my money. Well, we should at least look at that system. I'm not saying we need to switch to that system, but if it's working, and it's working well in Tennessee, because we know that in Tennessee, prior to the pandemic, there were, I forget the numbers going, I think it was 1,000 people a day or a week or whatever, and I don't have the statistic with me anymore, moving to Nashville because people were going to the community with less taxes, a good quality of life. By the way, we talked about that in one of our earlier town halls. People are going to go where they have a good quality of life and where they have a low tax. And that's where they're going to move to. And I think in the end, we got to make sure that Ohio has a good quality of life, which the number one asset we have in Ohio, based on US News and World Report, is opportunity. And I think Ohio does have great opportunity, and we got to expand on that opportunity, but we got to start cutting our burden and reducing our tax so that people want to stay here.
Thanks, Jack. We're going to move next to Greg. Greg, go ahead, unmute and go ahead.
Hey, Mr. Renacci, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, thanks for taking this. Just up the road from you in Brunswick here, so you can understand a little bit more about Northeast Ohio. I have 2 questions on taxes. One, we were living in Parma Heights for the longest time. We moved to Medina County a couple of years ago because of property taxes. In Parma Heights, I had no city services, but I pay a little more than double what I pay now in property tax. But the one thing I don't understand is why it's gonna go up, because the more people that keep moving into our county, different things like that, eventually they just keep raising everything, and it just keeps going up and up. And for anybody who tells us, well, we're gonna lower property taxes, or the other outdated tax with the income tax with most states, there's no need for an income tax as long as they understand how to spend. But we are so outdated. But the problem comes back to everybody from Strickland to Kasich to DeWine. They all tell us we're going to lower taxes. DeWine gets in office, the first thing he did was give us a gas tax rate. Enough's enough. I earn a living, and I hate to use this as an example, but the federal government talks about raising the minimum wage. Well, So if I'm unskilled, I don't have to do anything and I can just keep making more money. You know, I bust my butt to make what I wanted. I'm sick and tired of my money going away, going to something. I'm not getting anything out of it. So why I was so interested in what you say is because of how, you know, listening to you with interviews with different talk shows. At the end of the day, where is this going? How do I know I could put faith into you when everybody has told us, even from, you know, the federal to the state, they're not going to raise our tax, and the first thing they do, that's exactly what they do. So, you know, getting rid of the income tax is something that would keep me going. My wife was moved to county because I was set to move out of state and go to Florida, and I'm only 47 years old. I love the state. I love being in Northeast Ohio, but I hate what I'm paying here.
Well, Greg, thank you. And look, you're one of many that are saying the same thing. Why are people leaving? They're leaving because we're taxed too much. And you just hit the nail on the head, where you can move out of one jurisdiction into another jurisdiction, and then that jurisdiction might not have an income tax, but they raise the property tax. So in the end, the only way we're going to fix this is to start bringing this overhead down and start looking at ways to change our spending habits in the state. So you're exactly right. The first thing any elected official does is they go in and they raise spending. You said it, Governor DeWine. First thing he did, raise spending. Everybody raises spending. And you know why they raise spending? They go, well, our revenues are projected to come in higher. Well, guess what? That's great that your revenues are projected to come in higher. But sometimes you should roll that back to the taxpayers and figure out ways to reduce the overhead and figure out ways to grow the economy. Or, you know, these are the things that we don't do enough of. You know, we're going to have one entire subject on Jobs Ohio. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail on that, but if you think about it, we take all of our liquor sales and we take a portion of that money, which there's a tax on, and we give it to an organization called Jobs Ohio. And then Jobs Ohio is supposed to help us grow our communities. But we lost 6,200 jobs in 2019. Remember, before the pandemic, 2019, Ohio as a state lost 6,200 jobs. The only way you can reduce taxes in this state is you either reduce the overhead or bring in more tax revenue, which means bring in more jobs, bring in more business, and bring in more people that will work and pay the taxes. Otherwise, you're in a terrible circle, which is where we're at today, where our spending continues to go up, governors continue to raise it, people are leaving, our population's getting older, our tax burden has to pay for it. Only one way to fix it: bring our spending down, get our overhead down, consolidate some of our schools and municipalities, at least talk about it. Again, there'll be people on this town hall tonight that'll say, I don't want my school district consolidated. I don't want my city consolidated. I'm not saying you have to do that, but we got to start looking at, why does every city have a fire chief when some cities only have 2,000 or 3,000 people, or villages, and other cities have 17,000? Maybe the fire department can take care of both communities. Maybe the police can take care of both communities. And I'm a big supporter. I was a firefighter. I'm a big supporter of first responders. But again, maybe we got to start looking at this, because as our state population starts to age and starts to not be able to keep up with the growing populations of many other states, the burden continues to get worse. So people are moving. It's interesting. I have another son who actually moved. He works in Cuyahoga County, but he looked around and tried, he wanted to stay in Ohio, and he looked around and tried to find where the least amount of taxes were. And that's where he moved to. Again, people move to where there's a good quality of life and the taxes are the lowest.
Thanks, Craig. Next question is from William Ham.
Hi, Jim. I took some of the slides that you had in your first presentation, and I showed them to my representative, Tom Patton. I've got the feeling that these representatives in the Ohio Congress don't really understand what's going on. So they think they're doing a good job, but they aren't. How can we give them more information to say, hey, it's not working, and here are some suggestions?
Great question. And it's one of the reasons why we're doing these town halls. And look, Tom Patton's a friend of mine. Um, I talk to him on occasions. In many cases, we have members of the General Assembly who have never made a payroll. And I'm not saying that about Tom. Tom's actually has done this. But we have many members of the General Assembly who have never made a payroll, who've never run a business, who are now making decisions on spending and taxes, and all they're given is what's put in front of them. I mean, I always tell the story about Jim Renacci when I was in Congress. You know, there are so many people in the US Congress that have never made a payroll, don't understand business, don't understand taxation. They get elected because of popularity. They come to Washington. They have no clue what's going on, and they have to make all of their decisions based on hiring some staff members who they've got to listen to. Now, me, on the other hand, because I had 30 years experience, because I've made budgets and created jobs and employed people, I used to tell my staff, no, that's just not correct. You got this all wrong. I would have to tell my staff, who are supposed to be telling me, and by the way, remember, that's what they're doing. They're telling members of Congress or General Assembly, here's the way it works. I would have to tell them that's not the way it works. So I think the answer is the best thing we can do is become educated. One thing Ohio's Future Foundation continues to do is educate and let people know some of these. That's why we have a set of series. You know, we talked early about some of the problems in Ohio and some of the ways we can fix it. We're going to start going down the road and talking about, you know, whether it's we tax too much, whether it's Jobs Ohio, whether it's cat tax, whether it's corruption. I mean, these all cost the state money, and when they cost the state money, they cost increases in taxes. So we have to fix all this, and we got to educate ourselves, and then we got to work with our representatives, and hopefully our representatives will be listening as well.
Great. Thank you, William. We're going to move next to Sue Ellen. Sue Ellen, you can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Sure
I
can.
can hear
Go
you.
ahead.
Okay, I got a couple comments and a question. I know, Mr. Renacci, you're talking about growth for Ohio. And Ohio originally was called the invention state. There's books out about all the inventions that started in Ohio, and I'm just giving examples like National Cash Register, Thomas Edison, Kettering, et cetera, et cetera. If we could focus on becoming the invention state again, that would give us some growth. That's one comment. The other thing is, this is kind of, I know you mentioned you like Ohio. So this is one unique point about Ohio. It was written in a book called Pioneers by David McCullough. And Ohio was the first state to have existed and governed under the United States Constitution. The 13 colonies never actually worked under the US Constitution, but the first state was Ohio. So I think that's pretty cool. It's our big claim to fame you don't hear. A tax question I have is, what do you think about, and I'm not sure if states are involved in this, the TIFs, the tax incremental funding. What do you think about those as an accountant? Good or bad or what?
So TIFs are exactly right. And by the way, I want to go back to Ohio. Ohio, I moved here, 37 years ago. Maybe it's 38 years ago, because Ohio was the land of opportunity. We have so many great things, from the invention state, like you talked about, to the river on the south, to the lake on the north, to the two Hall of Fames, to the 2 amusement parks, to the big national park in the center of the state. We are a land of opportunity, and we've got to make sure that people are aware of that. TIF financing, that's for anybody on tonight that doesn't know what TIF is, tax incremental financing. It's when you take, the best way to explain it, you have 30 acres of land out on the highway, and you want to develop that land. Today, that land pays $1,000 in real estate taxes a year to the communities. But if you put $100 million worth of new business on that property, let's say it would pay $1 million a year. So it pays $1,000 a year today. But if you put, you know, 10 million or $100 million worth of new property on that land, it's going to pay $1 million in taxes. So you look at that land and you say, all right, today, I only collect $1,000 and all the communities around only collect 1,000. But if we let this developer develop this property and he puts $100 million worth of assets and value on that property, we're going to collect $1 million worth of taxes. So what will allow, but for that developer to come and do that, he needs the infrastructure, the roadway, the SOAR, the laterals, he needs all of the infrastructure. So what you do with the TIF financing is you take part of that $1 million that you're going to get after it's all developed, and you allow it to be put back into the infrastructure. So instead of the schools and the city for the first 10 years getting $1 million worth of tax, they only get $500,000 worth of tax, and the other $500,000 goes back into the roads and the infrastructure. Now, if you're in a school district, you would say, I want the $1 million. Or if you're a city, I want the $1 million. But the way you have to look at it is that piece of property was only paying $1,000. It's just vacant land. And now it's going to pay $1 million. So if you give up half of that for 10 years, you get to keep the $1 million for perpetuity after the 10 years. So I think tax increment financing, if done the right way, is a good way of building out and growing a community. I think if it's done the wrong way, it's not. But there are examples where it was done very well. There are examples where it was not done very well. And I think to answer your question, that's the only way you can really develop. That's the only way cities in many cases can develop, because they don't have the $500,000 of revenue every year today to build out all the infrastructure. So they finance it, and then they take half of the real estate taxes to pay it back. In the end, long term, again, if we're talking, I like to talk about not the next election, but the next generation. If we're talking about the next generation and it's done right, tax increment and financing is a very good way of growing our communities.
Thanks, Sue Ellen. Pam Wilson, you're up next.
Hi, Mr. Renacci. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Pam.
Hey, sir. Well, thank you for taking my question. I know we've been talking a lot about big government spending, and I saw that, you've described Governor DeWine's recently unveiled budget that provides a significant amount of money to businesses that have been harmed during the pandemic, and also has money for broadband infrastructure as big government spending. So I guess my question really is, do you disagree with President Trump about the importance of direct payments? And why do you think that people shouldn't have access to broadband in rural Ohio?
Great question. I think people should have access to broadband. I'm just not sure that you've got to make sure you can pay for it. You got to have a long-term plan, and you just can't come out and say, oh, I'm just going to spend money. I think there has to be a plan. You got to work with the communities, and I think it needs to be done properly. When it comes to payments, so one of our plans, one of the things I think does need to be done, by the way, it's amazing. We were talking about broadband and how we need to get it to rural Ohio last year. Governor DeWine's talking about it this year. I'm happy to see he's listening. I mean, that's one of the good things. There are some things that we've been talking about over the last year and a half to 2 years that the governor is starting to talk about. So if nothing else, this is good. Now, direct payments. Let's talk about that too. There are people that are definitely in need. And do I think the people in need, we got to do some things for? Yes. The problem is when you just toss $1,400 out to everybody. I'm going to give you another personal example. My mother's 94 years old. She does not need the $1,400, but she's going to get it. All right. I mean, those are the kind of examples. Now, the person that's struggling to pay their bills, to make their mortgage, to buy food, they need the $1,400. Those direct payments have to be direct to those that need it. We can't just keep printing money and printing money and printing money. By the way, that's where this all started. That's where the Ohio Future Foundation started. Because if the federal government, right now, Ohio, 23% of the revenue that Ohio brings in is federal subsidies, 23% before Corona spending. Now, for coronavirus spending, that number has gone up. On the average, though, 23% is coming from the federal government. So what do you think is going to happen when the federal government someday says, we don't have any more money, state of Ohio, you're on your own? That's a 23% cut to the revenues coming into the state. Now, you might say that'll never happen. I think someday it has to happen. We can't keep spending money in the federal government we don't have. So the answer is, do we need to make sure that direct payments get out? Yes. Do they need to get out to the right people? Yes. Should we be just sending checks out to everybody and anyone? No. And I think that's the problem. People in the legislature and people in the federal government just love to spend because they think about one thing, the next election. I'm more concerned about my 7-month-old grandchild and the next generation. Who's going to pay that back? That's a real question, and we need to make sure that we prepare for that. So thank you for your question.
Thanks again. Matthew Schaffler, you're up next.
Hi, Jim. I'm a school teacher here in Brecksville, and got also.
I'm gonna hear it from the school district. No, go
yes,
ahead.
no. I'm career and tech teacher. We are seeing a lot of students coming out of our programs unable to find jobs. I was just wondering if there could be any program that maybe subsidize some, employers getting these students jobs, because they're our next generation. I mean, we're going to have a shortfall in the HVAC industry, and a lot of people aren't wanting to take the chance on it because, well, now we're going to be coming up to these kids making almost $15 an hour coming out if minimum wage goes up, and companies can't survive paying somebody that because they're not producing. So I was wondering if there was any kind of like incentives that we could work out, because they're going to be paying into the tax system eventually, more, because their wages will be going up. Is there any kind of subsidies for small businesses that may help them incentivize hiring these students, so they're not, working at McDonald's because they can make just as much?
Yeah, Matt, by the way, career tech, I'm a big believer in. I've been talking about this for 2 years. Right now our system is so set up. By the way, we have so many school districts, and they all get so much money. And being involved, that the school district wants to keep as many students in the school district as they can because they need the money. But yet we should be doing more with VOTEC. We should be doing more with career tech. We should be doing more, because you can come out of school. I talk to so many people. I was talking to a woman whose son is a welder. She came out of career tech, never went to college. Her son, and her son's making twice as much as the person coming out of college. So we should start looking at that. But you're exactly right. We do have a problem on the job side. And the virus has hurt us. The shutdowns have hurt us. All of this pulling back in the economy has hurt us. One of the things I said that I was very concerned about, look, we do have a virus and we have a health crisis, but we also have an economic crisis. So Matt, you just hit on the problem. We have a health crisis, which has now expanded our economic crisis. And our economic crisis is that we have businesses that are saying, I'm not hiring. I mean, I told you about my son who's going to graduate from medical school in June. He can't get a job except for 2 places. And he's a doctor.
Yeah,
And go ahead.
yeah, I'm also a local politician as a councilman, and we are getting hammered really hard with our city income tax budget. And I'd be interested to see how other states fund their city budgets, because we would definitely take a hit if we lost our city income tax. That's for sure.
No, and I would agree. And I would tell you this. So think about how does Tennessee do it? How do some of these other states do it? I'm not saying we have to switch, but I'm saying we should be looking. I mean, like everything that I have done by laying this plan out is because I've looked at other states and what they're doing. We should at least talk about it. We should at least look at it. We should figure out why other states are growing and prospering and why we're not. And then we should change our policies. Look, the University of Akron did a study, and for those on the call tonight, you can get it at jimrenacci.com. University of Akron did a study. It's called Falling Behind: How Ohio Continues to Lose Its Place in the U.S. Economy. And it talks about some of these same issues we're talking about tonight. We have to start looking at what other states are doing, and we have to start changing our policies. Somebody told me the other day that the biggest problem with Ohio is the past couple administrations have been maintenance governors. Maintenance governors, which means we just maintain the status quo. And then you look at other states and they're changing rapidly. Isn't it amazing that Cleveland is ranked one of the 10 worst cities in the country, and Pittsburgh, 110 miles away, is ranked one of the top 10 cities in the country? There's a reason. Pittsburgh is 20 years ahead of Cleveland. And they talk about this in the University of Akron study. Pittsburgh has economic diversity. Cleveland doesn't have economic diversity. Economic diversity is when you have a lot of small businesses, entrepreneurship, all those things that can help grow jobs and opportunities. We've got to start looking at what other cities are doing. Just like you said, we got to start looking at how other cities are funding their city income tax.
Great. We're going to try to squeeze in as many questions here in the last 15 minutes or so we have left. So if your question can be brief, we're going to get you going. Next, we have Dale Cummins.
Yeah, Jim, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dale.
Great. Thanks for taking my question. I've actually got first to tell you I endorse your ideas. And by route, I'd like to give you an illustration. I live in a city suburb of Cincinnati. That city is 6 square miles. We have a complete city council, mayor, and so forth. We have a police department of 75 people, 6 square miles. I could police it myself with a single car. We also have a complete fire department, a complete school system, and recently we have the audacity to start up an income tax division, complete with a director and income tax auditors to audit all of us. So there's your illustration, sir, and I endorse what you said. But my question to you really is, I was on Telegram today and we were talking about ways to bring fresh politicians into Ohio and to get rid of our stuffed politician suits. Do you have any suggestions for us?
Well, Del, first off, I thank you for bringing me that city. I'd like to, that city is the perfect example. And I'm hoping that offline or somehow we can get you to let us know what that city is. But to give you an example, that what you just said is happening all over the state, because the state was growing at one point in time. So townships became 2 cities or 3 cities. And I can give you examples in Northeast Ohio where one township became 3 cities because of its population growth. But today, those 3 cities have less population than the township had 20 years ago when they decided they were going to be 3 cities. And yet the 3 cities have 3 fire chiefs, have 3 police chiefs. We should be looking at some of this stuff and bringing our costs down. When it comes to changing the faces of politicians, that's got to be our job. Look, nobody was more frustrated with politicians than Jim Renacci. And if you heard my story in the beginning, when I said, they took my dealership and they took 58 jobs away. They being the federal government, decided that my business wasn't essential. That most people in Washington have never run a business. Ohio's leadership had decided at one point in time during the coronavirus, which businesses were essential, which businesses weren't essential. We're going to close you down at 10 o'clock because we think the coronavirus gets worse at 10 o'clock. Now, I got to tell you, I owned a bar and restaurant. I owned 3 of them at one point in time. You don't make money in a bar and restaurant until 10 o'clock at night in many cases. In fact, when you curfew a bar and restaurant at 10 o'clock at night, you're basically taking the lifeblood away. This is what political leaders do when they've never had to run anything. So how do we change that? Just like tonight, we keep talking about it. We bring new faces into the position. We start looking at people who are running. I mean, look, we have an open Senate seat. Rob Portman stepping down. Has anybody paid attention to everybody who's jumping in that race? They're all politicians in most cases. There are a couple business people. If you want to change things, put the business people in. And I think that's what we got to start doing. We cannot continue down this path and not start to realize that career politicians who've never worked a day in their life are running in many cases, our state, our county, our country. And what we really need to do is put people in who have risk payroll, understand what it is to have to make a mortgage, and understand what it is to balance a budget. And if you do that, we can change things. So we got to quit electing people just because we know them. I'll go back to my election, 2018. Sherrod Brown spends 30.5 million, 33.5. I spend 4 million. I lose the election by 150,000 votes, net 150,000 votes, because only 41% of independents knew who Jim Renacci was. So what do you think the 59% of independents, who do you think they vote for? They go in a voting booth and they vote for the person who has the name ID. If you want to change it, start talking to your neighbors, your relatives, your friends, and say, we got to start electing people who are qualified, not people who have name ID.
We're going to squeeze in 2 more questions. Next, who do we have up here? Rich Richardson.
Yes, sir. Jim, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Rich.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for taking my question. I've been a big fan since you were trying to take down Sherrod Brown in 2018. I know she's one of the most liberal members in the entire Congress. But I gotta ask. I was gonna ask something about business investment, but I changed my mind because I know you're a big business guy. But I gotta say, I keep up with campaign spending because I want to know who's funding whose campaigns, who's backed by the corporations. But I did notice that you had about $80,000 in your campaign debt. So, as you said, with trusting politicians, how can I trust you to keep our budget balanced if you can't balance your campaign budget?
Well, it's interesting you said that because that was reported, Rich, by the plain dealer, I think, and we don't have 80,000 in debt. I actually called my accountants after and said, "Hey, what is this 80,000 in debt?" Because I don't have any debt in that campaign, and we are actually looking into it. And I can tell you that the next time we file, that 80,000 will be zero. So thank you for your question. There isn't $80,000 worth of debt. That's a mistake on the report because we don't have those bills and we've paid everything off. But I thank you for bringing that up. And I think you'll see on the next report when there is one filed. By the way, that campaign's been closed for 4 years, just so you know. That there has been nothing going on in that account for 4 years. And that's one of the reasons why nobody has looked at it for 4 years. But thank you for your question. I 100% agree with you, but we don't have any debt. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you bringing it up. And I hope you got a good answer there because that's the truth. We should not have debt, and I don't have debt. So thank you.
All right, we're going to fit in one last question. Our last question tonight is James Moon.
Thank you. First off, I moved to Ohio from Connecticut to retire because I was basically taxed out of Connecticut, and I don't especially want to be taxed out of Ohio. Jim, would you favor a consumption tax to replace property taxes and an income tax in Ohio?
I would favor so ultimately I spent almost 2 years in Washington trying to build a tax model. I actually worked with the Tax Foundation, which is a non-for-profit organization. And I also worked with 2 tax attorneys for almost 2 years. I learned at one point in time, I thought a consumption tax was the worst tax in the world because that's what I heard. I didn't realize that a consumption tax actually grows jobs and is a very positive tax if done in the right way. Now it has to replace all those other taxes. So to answer your question is, if there was a way to get to a pure consumption tax based on my 2 years of learning and studying consumption taxes, I think that's probably the best way to go for any state to get to a pure and eliminate everything else. It can't happen in Ohio overnight. It can't happen probably in the next couple of years, but it has to be a goal that we reduce all of these burdensome taxes and get as close to a consumption tax model as we can.
Great. Thanks for that question. We actually did get through all of our questions tonight. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left here. Jim, if you want to wrap it up.
Sure. Well, look, I want to thank everybody for being on the call tonight. This is about continuing to get our message out about how we can make Ohio first again, how we can move Ohio, and how we can learn from you. I mean, I will tell you that too often politicians don't listen. I've traveled the state for 2 years listening and having these kind of town halls. It's difficult that we can't do that now when we're in a situation of COVID, which I understand. We got to be safe. And that's why these town halls make for opportunities to communicate and talk and get a message out. So I want to thank you all for being on the call tonight. I appreciate the questions and I appreciate the candor. Hopefully we're going to learn together and hopefully we can continue to roll out a plan to really move Ohio forward. So thank you again. And I appreciate it. I look forward. We're going to continue. We've got another series coming up in the next couple of weeks. Please stay tuned, please join, and please go to jimrenacci.com/join if you'd like to join in with our group and move forward, or you can talk to me on facebook.com/jimrenacci or twitter.com/jimrenacci. I look forward to keeping in touch with you. Thank you again. You have a great evening.